completely.
John Prescott certainly has better relations with other European environment ministers than some of his Tory predecessors, but behind the smiles in Portugal, Britain is struggling to avoid being isolated once again on the issue of nuclear discharges. At stake is the future of reprocessing at Sellafield, with several countries insisting that water leaving such plants should contain no radioactivity. The strongest pressure is coming from the Scandinavians and the country whose coastline is directly opposite the discharges from Sellafield.
This is totally unacceptable, and we believe that all discharges should stop in keeping with best environmental practice. Urgent steps should be taken now to stop all discharges from reprocessing plants.
It was left to John Prescott's deputy to explain Britain's problem at these negotiations.
I will be perfectly honest, because the present British government is not responsible for what has happened in the past. The problem is that is virtually impossible in practice, not because we disagree with the objective, but because of the legacy of past activities.
The state-owned operators of Sellafield are in Portugal to put their own spin on the proposal to ban all radiation going into the sea.
Well, the zero option is not an option for Sellafield. We cannot carry on with the work that goes on at Sellafield with no discharges, but we will work with the government and with our regulators to ensure that we reduce discharges as far as possible.
So I've got the letter in here. We'll keep it dry. You'll have to get an iron out though. So.
This is a sensitive issue for John Prescott. He once swam 2 miles up the Thames to deliver a letter to Mrs. Thatcher protesting against the dumping of nuclear waste at sea. Both sides in this argument have put their public positions. Now they're meeting behind closed doors to hammer out some sort of compromise. John Prescott's problem is to find one which leaves his green credentials intact without endangering the future of Sellafield. Tim Hirsch, BBC News, Sintra in Portugal.
During the 1960s and 70s, large amounts of wastewater contaminated with radioactivity were discharged into the Irish Sea from Sellafield. Although the levels have fallen significantly, the plant is still allowed to release small amounts. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson looks at what's being behind calls for the so-called zero option.
It's one of the biggest nuclear plants in the world. Its brooding presence dominates the landscape. It provides jobs for thousands, but it discharges radioactivity to the Irish Sea. Much less than it used to, but enough to embarrass the government and threaten Sellafield's future. So what does Sellafield do? For years, trains have brought flasks of used nuclear fuel to Sellafield from power stations throughout Britain. Here, the fuel is first put into storage ponds. Later, it's dissolved in acid, the useful chemicals are reclaimed, and the radioactive waste is stored. But this reprocessing, as it's called, produces a lot of wastewater. It's that water, together with rainwater from the site, which is discharged to the sea. Sellafield discharges well over 1 million gallons of wastewater a day. For most of the 70s, this water was fairly heavily contaminated with radioactivity. It began to accumulate in shellfish, and that posed a potential threat to people who ate them. Since then, the company spent £750 million building several plants to reduce radioactivity in the water before it's discharged. Over the years, the amount of radioactivity going down the pipe has dropped 100-fold. So if the company can reduce contamination this much, why can't they go for the so-called zero option and get rid of it altogether? There are two reasons. First, it would be hugely expensive. And second, there's one chemical dissolved in the water which can't easily be removed. It's so inert, there's no existing way to get rid of it. After 45 years of Sellafield, radioactivity has built up in the Irish Sea. Current discharges may be very low, but they continue to accumulate. Whether the discharges are a real threat to human health may be questionable. Politically, though, they're a major threat to the health of the nuclear industry itself. James Wilkinson, BBC News.
The government space program, Allan has died in California. He was 74. The astronaut, a former Navy test pilot, became the first American in space in 1961. He returned to space only once, 14 years later, as commander of Apollo 14, when he walked on the moon.
All right, lift off and the clock is started.
The blast-off from Cape Canaveral that lifted Allan Shepard into space on May the 5th, 1961, was a pivotal event in space history. His 15-minute flight made him the first ever American in space, even though the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was there first, 23 days before him. It wasn't his last historic venture, though. After he returned safely, splashing down in a capsule in the Atlantic Ocean, President Kennedy declared his ambitious goal to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And 10 years later, Allan Shepard, now commander of Apollo 14, became one of only a dozen people to walk on the moon, and the only one ever to hit a lunar golf ball.
There on the moon, he lived every golfer's dream, taking his 6-iron and hitting the ball, in his words, for miles and miles. Allan Shepard truly had the right stuff.
It was a golf shot he replayed repeatedly, his good humor masking a determination that on his death his fellow astronaut paid tribute to.
No one was more dedicated to this country and to the astronaut program, to flying, to the Navy, to being a dedicated patriot in this country.
The excitement of early space travel may have faded, but Allan Shepard's spacecraft here in Washington is now a national icon. His daring in making that first flight hasn't been forgotten. Bridget Kendall, BBC News at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington.
And the main news tonight, the House of Lords has just started voting in its showdown with the Commons over the age of consent for homosexuals.